Welcome to the Lean and Agile Thinking for NGOs and Nonprofits interview with Dr. Jeffrey Leiker and Dr. Andrew Parris, Chapter 3. In this chapter, we discuss specific challenges in the NGO world, including high turnover, risk and variation, and lean approaches to them.
Here's another challenge, which is high turnover. And because of the stress, because of the challenging circumstances that we find ourselves in, we do have relatively high turnover in our organizations. We also, and maybe this is not the easiest thing to combine it with, but we also have a lot of external variation that impacts the organization, everything that we do. How does lean help us, or does that make it harder? For me, it seemed to make it quite a bit harder to do lean, to get lean going in an organization, in a country program, for example. I also feel that the external variation makes the experiments more difficult because things can go awry for reasons outside of our control. So how would lean TPS help us to address some of these challenges, or how would you maybe need to modify your approach to lean?
Right. So we worked with one of my doctoral students worked with an organization in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I live, that ships food. They call it artisanal food. It's high-end food around the United States, called Zingerman's Mail Order. And it started with a delicatessen that became quite famous, that has really high quality food from all over, like a small farm in Italy, and they'll find the best olives, and then they'll import the olives, and it's not real high volume. But anyway, they were having a problem that number one, they had to move every 2 years because they were growing very quickly, and they would run out of space. And the second problem was that they're very seasonal. So 50% of their sales happens in about 3 weeks between around Thanksgiving and Christmas, in that vicinity. And then for a lot of the year, they have very little work. So their approach is to hire lots of people. Like they might go from 80 people to 450 people within 2-week period. And all those other people that are at the core are new. They're only going to be there for a few weeks, and then they're going to be leaving. So we worked with them. My student worked with them. We've actually documented it in not a big textbook, but a comic book, a graphic novel, about lean in a high variability environment where there's lots of things going on, lots of change, lots of variety in what your products are and services are. And we tell the story of their progression, their evolution. And at first, it was really operating the technical system, and it was to get some degree of flow, because they have to pick stuff, they have to put it in boxes, and it was happening fairly haphazardly. And they were running out of parts, they're running out of the product that they needed, and they didn't know what they needed. They didn't even know how many people they needed. So we had to stabilize the process. And then we used some of the tools of lean, of like setting up a one-piece flow line to pick the parts and put them in boxes, and using visual management to so when I'm creating a gift basket, they can take the objects and put them on a template, and they know they have the right stuff that goes in the box. And so there's a bunch of little things like that. But the other thing was standardized work, having a standardized process for doing everything, like taking bread and slicing it and putting it in a bag and getting it ready to put on the line to be picked. So they went through the whole plant, and they had, for example, been creating all these gift boxes overnight the night before, and that's why they're running out of space. And they realized they could actually build the gift boxes in the process of serving the customer to rhythm, what's called in lean the tact, which is like a metronome, the rate of customer demand. The result of that was that they got far more efficient, more productive, but they haven't moved since. This was about 15 years ago, and they're moving every 2 or 3 years. They've saved millions just on moving. And they realized that the issue was not space, it was how they operated. And now when they hire those several hundred people, they introduce them to a system instead of saying, good luck, stick this in a box.
Mhm.
And they found that the more that they have standard work and the quick and visual management, the quicker they can teach the people, and the fewer errors they make and all that. And people actually enjoy it. They don't particularly like dealing with crises every minute. The other thing they realized, though, that was key was that as we're going through this transformation, the long-term employees who are there all the 80 who are there all year, including the managers and supervisors, were the people we were training. And they're learning to understand how to understand processes, how to observe them, how to improve them. And this idea of one-piece flow and the idea of visual management and standardized work, they're learning all this stuff. And then when at some point after a few years, they came to the realization that those people, when they hire the hundreds, should actually be like your process facilitators, like your role.
Mhm.
They should be offline training and responding to the needs of the people that are novices.
Yep.
Yeah.
Doing the work.
And so they became what Toyota would call group leaders. And every year, that few-week period that normally was chaos, every year it got a little less chaotic and a little less chaotic to the point where, I'd talk to the manager of the facility and, how's it going? And I'm calling right in the middle in December and saying, well, I'm sitting talking to you. I could never have done that a few years ago. And he said, it's going so well. I'm sort of scratching my head waiting for the next crisis, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So anyway, the point is that it is a socio-technical system, and the technical side is these tools and having a process that flows, that's relatively rational, that makes sense, and where people know what they're supposed to be doing. But then the social side was developing these leaders.
Yeah.
And because of all this fluctuation and people coming and going, having a core group of leaders was critical. And with that core group of leaders, they could bring in somebody, have them doing the work within, they've gotten to the point where they want to train on any job in 15 minutes. So within 15 minutes, you're working, and then they're coaching and helping, and they're jumping in when they have to, and there's a bit of a crisis. But the leaders become critical for teaching and coaching during that few-week period. Then January comes, and they reflect on what happened in that, and they spend the rest of the year improving, so next year will be better. And that's just one example, and it's not, it obviously doesn't fit every case, but the point is that I think that using the tools to effectively create processes that you can control is key. And second, having leaders who stay around. If you have turnover in supervisors and every 3 months you're getting in a new supervisor who's never experienced lean before, doesn't know this operation, doesn't know the people involved in your customer base, then you're really in trouble. Then there's chaos leading chaos.
Long time ago, you and I spent a lot of time talking about one of the old mantras: people, process, and technology in that order. Starting with the developing people who own their processes and improve their processes, and apply technology judiciously only when it adds value. The two examples that have just come up, the TSSC, the New York City Food Bank, and the Zingermans, are both sort of repetitive situations. There's a lot of variation from order to order on Zingerman's, but it's still a flow line, and standard work on the process appears. What Andrew raised earlier is many NGOs, when they get into the field, they probably have a playbook. There are certain things they do. There are certain, policy manuals and procedure manuals and all of that. But when you're on the ground and you've just had an earthquake or there's a war going on, things don't go always as planned. And a lot of what you do is reacting and solving problems, trying to open up a space to run the processes that have to deliver things reliably. And so this is not so much a question as an observation I'd like you to reflect on. I've heard that in the absence of a clearly defined process of what you're doing at a moment like that, there's the rigorous process of problem solving, where a team that is facing a situation they've never done before can come together in a way that they're comfortable with and solve it, pick it apart, break it down into the component parts, and quickly get to the core of what they need to do at that time so they can stabilize the situation and get it back into a process again. If there's any sense to what I've just said, I'd love to hear
No,
you.
no, there's a lot of sense to it. There's a concept in organizational design called buffering the core. And what they say is one way to deal with an organization that has information overload, that has a lot of uncertainty and a lot of information coming at it, and it needs to react and adapt. One way to deal with that is to figure out what are your core processes and how can we create a buffer around those so they're relatively untouched by these disruptions. And then we can focus our attention on the disruptions. So in Toyota's case, the factory is clearly what they want to buffer. And they want to have a very consistent process of making cars. And in Zingerman's case, they want to have a very consistent process of taking things off a shelf and picking the right things and putting them into boxes and gift boxes and make them look nice and putting the right cards in and getting the right label on it. And so that process of getting from stuff to it's in the mail, that is the core that they want to buffer. But they also realized that there's a lot of change, because at one point they're doing a box every 6 seconds, and then another point they're doing a box every 3 minutes, and there's different numbers of people involved, and they are going to do different jobs. They have to do a lot more jobs because there are fewer of them. Once they have the standard sort of building blocks, they can scale up or scale down relatively easily. But then they also are dealing with like COVID. So COVID comes along and they're putting things in boxes, but nobody can be near each other. And you don't want to touch a box that somebody else touched. So by the time they reached COVID, because for years they had been fine-tuning the standard process and they had developed the chops to problem solve, this PDCA I talked about, then they were able to turn that to what do we do now? COVID hit and the whole world has changed within the last week. And they were able to do things like deal with remote meetings and with figuring out how people will wash their hands and figuring out how to space jobs apart from each other. And they worked that all out really well at a level that they would never have done before they learned about lean. Part of that was because they had standard processes. They still are using those, just in a different way. And part of that was because they had learned this way of thinking of you're mentioning problem solving. The problem solving process, if you take the simple, some call it plan, do, check, act, some call it plan, do, study, adjust. But if you take that simple 4-step model, you always have to start with a plan, which always starts with understanding what you're trying to accomplish. You have to always understand where you are, what the current condition is. And then you have to take small steps and start working your way, learning your way to the goal that you have. So that's just ingrained in every single person who works in Toyota. So for example, when there was the nuclear plant meltdown in Fukushima in Japan because of the tsunami, they lost all their semiconductors. They were all built in one plant in that area, and the plant was wiped out. And because of the fallout of the nuclear disaster, they couldn't operate certain plants, so they had part shortages. So they didn't have to go to the assembly line and say, how do you fix this? They got a room. And Toyota calls it a big room process, which they call Obeya. So it's a kind of a Japanese name for it, but it just means big room. But they're very good at visual management. So they populated the room with all the visuals, and they had to gather lots of information to know what plants were shut down, what their current state was. Actually, the first thing they did was the Akiyutada, the CEO at the time, says job one is to bring food and water to the people who need it in those areas that were damaged. So they quickly planned that out, mobilized a bunch of TED employees, got trucks, and they started shipping stuff up there. But they did it in a very efficient way because that's what they're used to doing, because they have this way of thinking. Then they had to understand what the status of all these plants were and where they could send people and engineers to rebuild the plants or get the processes going again. And then they had other groups of people who were looking at where they can offload some of that production work to other suppliers who are also very capable and understand lean and very adaptive. So the same kind of discipline of an orchestrated process that they use in a routine way in the factory help them to address these crisis conditions in a very unstructured problem that they'd never faced before. And but at the same time, their factories were still running, or if they didn't have parts, they had to shut down. But then they figured out how to allocate those parts. And once they got the parts, they could very quickly reconfigure to make the smaller volumes that they needed to make. And then as they got more parts, they could ramp up very efficiently, which is a whole another discipline. So the number one, the standard processes they developed served them well. But number two, the way of thinking of problem solving and being very disciplined in their planning, as you said, allowed them to adapt to the crisis. And I remember interviewing Akio Toyoda, the president of Toyota. It was after the recall crisis. It was after the tsunami. There was the worst hurricane in history in Thailand, where they have a bunch of part supply. There was a financial crisis. And I remember talking to Akio Toyoda, and he said, I've been president for 4 years. In every year, we've had a crisis that has never been experienced in recorded history before. This is the first year where I don't have a crisis. This is the 5th year. And he said, this is going to be my toughest year as a leader, because a crisis automatically mobilizes people. And now I have to motivate them when there's not a crisis.